Are you enjoying these untold Sherlock Holmes stories? If so, you can listen to even more exclusive Untold Sherlock Holmes adventures on my Patreon. Do check it out. The link is in the description below. The Adventure of the Two Patriarchs. The month of August, in the year of our Lord, 1894, was one of the most sweltering I can recall in all my years residing in London. A heavy, relentless heat had settled upon the great metropolis, baking the brickwork of Baker Street and turning the normally bustling thoroughfares into sluggish, dust-choked arteries. The Thames itself seemed to exude a languid, unwholesome vapour, and the fashionable elite of the city had long since fled to their country estates or the cooler climes of the continent. I, however, found myself anchored to our lodgings, a prisoner of my own medical practice's fluctuating demands, while my friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, was tethered by a far more formidable chain, the crushing, oppressive weight of his own inactivity. For 3 weeks, no case of any interest had presented itself. The criminal classes of London appeared to have succumbed to the heat wave, their nefarious activities entirely suspended by the stifling atmosphere. Holmes spent his days draped over the armchair in his dressing gown, his pipe emitting a constant, acrid cloud of shag tobacco, while his beloved Stradivarius lay neglected in its case. The only sounds in our sitting-room were the monotonous ticking of the mantel clock and the occasional sharp scrape of a vesta as he lit yet another pipe. I observed him with growing professional concern. The unnatural brilliance of his eyes and the restless twitch of his long, nervous fingers spoke of a mind that was devouring itself for lack of external stimulation. "It is a barren wasteland, Watson," he groaned one afternoon, tossing aside a crumpled copy of the Daily Telegraph. "Not a single spark of imagination in the whole of this vast, boiling city. The most one can hope for is a mislaid lapdog, or a clerk who has absconded with the petty cash. I tell you, Watson, if this continues, I shall be forced to resort to a 7% solution merely to keep my faculties from rusting." "You must have patience, Holmes," I replied gently, turning a page of my medical journal. "Even the criminal mind requires respite from this infernal heat." "Patience is a virtue for the unimaginative, my dear doctor," he retorted, springing suddenly from his chair and pacing the length of the room with the caged energy of a predatory cat. "My mind rebels at stagnation. Give me problems, give me work, give me the most abstruse cryptogram or the most intricate analysis, and I am in my proper atmosphere. This dull routine of existence is absolute torture." As if in direct answer to his desperate plea, the heavy tread of Mrs. Hudson sounded upon the stairs, followed by a sharp knock at our door. She entered, her face flushed from the heat, bearing a silver salver upon which rested a single, thick envelope. Holmes seized it with the avidity of a starving man. His eyes narrowed as he examined the heavy cream-coloured parchment and the imposing red wax seal that secured it. "The Foreign Office," he murmured, his listlessness vanishing in an instant. "And sealed with the personal signet of Lord Halifax. This is certainly no mislaid lapdog, Watson." He tore open the envelope, his eyes scanning the brief missive within. A low chuckle escaped his lips, and he tossed the letter across the table to me. "Read it aloud, Watson," he commanded, throwing himself back into his armchair and steepling his long, thin fingers together. I took up the letter and read. "My dear Mr. Holmes, A matter of the utmost delicacy and international gravity has arisen. I require your immediate presence at Whitehall. It concerns a crisis within the Egyptian Coptic Church which threatens to destabilize our entire administrative apparatus in Cairo. A carriage is waiting below. Yours faithfully, Halifax. Destabilize our apparatus in Cairo, I exclaimed, looking up at him. This sounds like a matter strictly for diplomats, Holmes, rather than a consulting detective. Diplomacy, Watson, is merely the art of concealing the truth, Holmes replied, his eyes gleaming with revived energy. When the truth becomes too thoroughly concealed, even for the diplomats to find, they are invariably forced to call upon me. Come, Watson, get your hat. The heat wave is broken, and the game is afoot. Within the hour we were seated in a plush, mahogany-panelled office, deep within the labyrinthine corridors of Whitehall. Lord Halifax, a tall, austere man with the weary countenance of one who bears the weight of the empire upon his shoulders, sat behind a massive desk. Beside him stood a younger man, his face bronzed by the sun, whom Halifax introduced as Mr. Arthur Pendleton, a senior liaison officer stationed in Alexandria. "Thank you for coming so swiftly, Mr. Holmes," Halifax began, leaning forward and resting his elbows upon the desk. "I shall speak plainly. We are facing a crisis of unparalleled absurdity, yet one which carries with it the threat of extreme violence. Are you familiar with the Coptic Orthodox Church?" "I am aware of its origins," Holmes replied seamlessly. "An ancient sect tracing its foundation to the Apostle Mark in the 1st century. They form a significant, albeit minority, Christian population within the Muslim-majority nation of Egypt. Their spiritual leader is the Patriarch of Alexandria." "Precisely," Pendleton interjected, his voice tight with anxiety. "The Patriarch is a figure of immense political and spiritual influence. Our administration relies heavily upon the stability of the Coptic community to maintain the balance of power in the region. A week ago, the elderly Patriarch, Cyril the 112th, passed away under sudden and somewhat mysterious circumstances." "Poison?" Holmes asked, his eyes half closed. "Suspected, though currently unproven," Pendleton admitted. "However, while his passing is suspicious, the true crisis lies in his succession. The Patriarchate is devoid of hereditary ties. It is selected through a complex process from among the desert monks. Before his death, Cyril had secretly nominated his successor, a highly revered monk named Amber Macarius, and bestowed upon him the sacred patriarchal ring and the decree of succession." "I foresee the complication," Holmes murmured. "There has been a disruption in this transmission." "A duplication, Mr. Holmes?" Lord Halifax groaned, pressing his hands to his temples. 3 days ago a man arrived in London, presenting himself to the Prime Minister as Amber Macarius, the new Coptic Patriarch. He bears the sacred ring, he possesses the decree, and he claims he has fled Egypt because elements within the government are attempting to assassinate him before he can be officially consecrated. "A dramatic tale?" I observed. "Is that difficult to verify?" "It would be simple enough," Pendleton said grimly, "were it not for the arrival of a second man at the docks in Southampton yesterday. He, too, presents himself as Amber Macarius. He possesses an identical ring and an identical decree. His story is that he was set upon in the desert, robbed of his vestments, and left for dead by an impostor." Holmes's eyes snapped open, a brilliant spark of genuine interest dancing within them. 2 patriarchs, 2 identical claims. both seeking the official recognition and protection of the British Crown. Exactly, Lord Halifax sighed, and we cannot afford to choose the wrong man. If we back the impostor and the truth surfaces later, the Coptic Church will fracture into civil war, leaving the streets of Cairo running with blood. The French, always searching for an excuse to undermine our authority in Egypt, are already hovering like vultures. We have housed the two men separately here in London, one at the Langham, the other at a discreet safe house in Kensington. We have interrogated them thoroughly. We have brought in experts in Egyptian dialects. They are identical in age, in physical appearance, in their theological knowledge, and in their recounting of Macarius's life. "A masterful piece of theatre," Holmes whispered, rubbing his hands together. "The impostor has been trained for this role for years, perhaps decades. He is a meticulously crafted mirror." "Can you help us, Mr. Holmes?" Halifax pleaded. "We have but a few days before the situation becomes public knowledge, and the press catches wind of it. You must find a way to distinguish the holy man from the charlatan." "I shall require unlimited access to both men," Holmes stated, rising to his feet. "Furthermore, I shall need you to procure a very specific item from the British Museum for me. Watson, our languor is thoroughly banished. We have a religious schism to heal." Our first visit was to the Langham Hotel, where the first claimant was being held under discreet, heavy guard by Scotland Yard. We were ushered into a lavish suite that smelled faintly of frankincense and stale air. Seated upon a velvet sofa was a man of striking appearance. He was perhaps 60 years of age, with a long, flowing beard the colour of winter snow. His skin possessed the texture of old leather, baked dark by the relentless Egyptian sun. He wore the black robes and the distinctive rounded turban of a Coptic monk. As we entered, he raised a hand adorned with a massive ancient gold ring bearing a complex engraved crest. "I am Macarius," he spoke, his voice a deep, resonant rumble, his English heavily accented, yet perfectly grammatical. "For what reason does the British government send detectives to my door rather than diplomats? Have I failed to provide proof of my identity?" Holmes stood before him, his keen eyes sweeping over the man from the top of his turban to the dusty sandals upon his feet. "Your Grace," Holmes began, his tone perfectly respectful, "I am here merely to expedite your recognition. The sudden appearance of a rival has understandably caused a slight delay." The man's eyes flashed with a sudden dark fire. "The dog who arrived in Southampton. He is a demon, a shadow sent by the enemies of the Church. I was ambushed on the road to Wadi Natron. My attendants were slaughtered. I barely escaped with my life, making my way to Alexandria and securing passage on a merchant vessel. He stole my identity. He cannot steal my soul." Holmes paced slowly around the man, his gaze analytical. "A harrowing escape. You must have travelled light. Yet I see you managed to retain the patriarchal ring." "I hid it beneath my tongue when they searched me," the monk replied smoothly. "Fascinating," Holmes murmured. "And tell me, Your Grace, in the monastery of St. Macarius, what is the customary hour for the singing of the Tasbeha?" "It begins at midnight and concludes with the dawn," the man answered without a moment's hesitation. "And the specific fast preceding the Feast of the Apostles?" "It varies according to the date of Pentecost, ranging from 15 to 49 days. Holmes asked a dozen more questions, rapid-fire inquiries regarding the intricate, highly specific liturgies and histories of the Coptic Church. To each, the claimant provided flawless, immediate answers. His knowledge was encyclopedic, his demeanour carrying the heavy, authoritative weight of a true spiritual leader. "I thank you for your time," Holmes finally said, bowing slightly. "We shall trouble you no further for the present." As we descended the stairs of the Langham, I looked at Holmes inquiringly. "He seems perfectly genuine to me, Holmes. His knowledge is flawless." "Too flawless, perhaps," Holmes muttered, lighting his pipe as we stepped out into the sweltering street. "Did you observe his hands, Watson?" "I noted the ring." "You see, and yet you fail to observe. The ring was indeed magnificent. However, look at the man's fingernails. They were manicured. Roughly done, perhaps, though filed nonetheless. A monk who has spent 40 years in the harsh, unforgiving environment of the desert of Scetis absolutely avoids filing his nails. Furthermore, while his skin was dark, the creases behind his ears and at the nape of his neck lacked the deep, ingrained weathering of a lifetime exposed to the sun. He has lived indoors, Watson. He may be a scholar, though he certainly lacks the hallmarks of a desert ascetic." "Then he must be the impostor," I cried. "Let us avoid leaping to conclusions before we have thoroughly examined the alternative," Holmes cautioned, hailing a hansom cab. "To Kensington, driver." The safe house in Kensington offered a stark contrast to the opulence of the Langham. It was a modest, dimly lit townhouse, heavily shuttered against the heat. Here the second claimant awaited us. As we were led into the parlour, an eerie sense of déjà vu washed over me. The man seated before us was a mirror image of the first. The same snowy beard, the same leathery skin, the same black robes, and, astonishingly, an absolutely identical gold ring rested upon his finger. Upon closer study, subtle differences emerged. This man's posture was slightly stooped, suggesting a frame accustomed to years of bending over ancient texts or kneeling on stone floors. His eyes held a deep, profound weariness, a sorrow radiating from his very soul. "Peace be unto you," he whispered as we entered, his voice weaker and raspier than the first man's. "And to you," Holmes replied. He approached the man, and without asking permission, gently took the monk's hands in his own. I watched as Holmes's thumbs traced the palms and the sides of the fingers. "You have been ill," Holmes noted, his eyes locked on the man's face. "A fever," the monk replied, coughing weakly. "Caught in the damp hold of the ship that brought me here. The true sickness is the betrayal. The man who claims my name was my most trusted disciple, Father Youssef. He poisoned my drink at the monastery. While I lay paralyzed near death, he took the decree and my ring. I was nursed back to health by a sympathetic novice. I commissioned a copy of the ring from a silversmith in Cairo to present myself to your government. The true power lies in the decree, which I hold." "The Timunans, so to see," Holmes said softly. "The plot thickens. The first man claims he was attacked on the road. You claim you were poisoned in your cell. The first man claims he hid the ring. You freely admit yours is a replica. I am a man of God. I speak only the truth," the monk said simply. Holmes proceeded to ask him the same battery of theological and liturgical questions he had posed to the first man. The answers were identical, delivered with the same quiet authority. When we finally left the Kensington house, the sun was beginning to set, casting long, bloody shadows across the pavement. The heat, however, had completely failed to abate. "Well, Watson," Holmes asked, leaning back against the leather cushions of our cab. "What do you make of our twin patriarchs?" "It is maddening," I confessed. "The second man seems more authentic. His hands, as you no doubt observed, were heavily calloused, suggesting a life of manual labour or intense asceticism. Admitting his ring is a fake lends immense credence to his honesty." "Excellent, Watson." Holmes clapped his hands together. "Your powers of observation are improving. The calluses are indeed significant. Did you also notice the faint purplish discoloration at the base of his gums when he spoke?" "A sign of scurvy?" I suggested, drawing upon my medical background. "Or the lingering effects of a specific slow-acting metallic poison," Holmes corrected. "A poison commonly used in the bazaars of Cairo to incapacitate without killing immediately. It supports his story of being poisoned. Yet the first man's story is equally plausible, and his command of English was remarkably sophisticated for a desert monk, suggesting extensive interaction with British officials, which a patriarch-in-waiting might logically possess. Then we are at a stalemate?" "Far from it," Holmes smiled grimly. "We have established that both men are intimately familiar with the theology, the rituals, and the history of the Coptic Church. One is the true Macarius, the other is a brilliant impostor, a man who has studied his subject so thoroughly that he has become him. To break this mirror, we cannot rely on what they know. We must rely on what the impostor cannot possibly know." "And what is that?" "The Coptic Church, Watson, is an ancient institution, steeped in tradition and secrecy. It has survived centuries of persecution by hiding its most profound mysteries behind a veil of obscurity. The Patriarch functions as the custodian of the Church's deepest esoteric traditions, exceeding the role of a mere administrator. The impostor has learned the public face of the Patriarchate perfectly. There is, however, a private face, a hidden language of the soul, taught exclusively to the true heir, apparent in the absolute isolation of the desert." Upon our return to Baker Street, Holmes immediately dispatched a telegram to Lord Halifax. He then spent the remainder of the evening immersed in a state of intense concentration. He pulled a dozen dusty, leather-bound volumes from the upper shelves of our bookcase, tomes on ancient linguistics, Coptology, and early Christian mysticism. He smoked pipe after pipe, his brow furrowed, occasionally jotting down a complex symbol upon a sheet of foolscap. The following morning Lord Halifax arrived at Baker Street, accompanied by a burly man carrying a heavily reinforced, iron-bound wooden box. The man looked exhausted and terrified in equal measure. "Mr. Holmes," Halifax said, wiping perspiration from his brow, "I have done as you asked. I must tell you, removing this from the British Museum required the direct authorization of the Prime Minister and the Archbishop of Canterbury. The curator nearly suffered a stroke." "It is a necessary risk," Holmes said, his eyes fixed hungrily upon the box. "Place it upon the table if you... ladies." The burly man set the box down and unlocked it with 2 separate keys. Holmes carefully lifted the lid. Inside, resting upon a bed of black velvet, was a fragile, crumbling manuscript. It was composed of papyrus, the edges frayed and darkened by the passage of millennia. The script upon it was bold, dark, and utterly incomprehensible to my eyes, a mixture of Greek letters and strange, flowing hieroglyphic forms. "Magnificent," Holmes breathed, leaning over the ancient document with a magnifying glass. The Codex of St. Shenouda, dating from the 5th century, one of the rarest documents on earth. "I do not understand, Holmes," I admitted. "It looks like standard Coptic." "To the untrained eye, yes," Holmes replied, without looking up. "The Coptic language has several dialects: Bohairic, Sahidic, Fayumic. This manuscript, Watson, entirely diverges from standard Sahidic. It is written in a highly obscure, monastic cipher dialect, used exclusively by the inner circle of the White Monastery in Upper Egypt 1,500 years ago. The dialect has been dead for a millennium. There are perhaps 3 scholars in all of Europe who can decipher a fraction of it." "And the Coptic Patriarch?" Lord Halifax asked, a dawn of comprehension breaking across his austere face. "The Patriarch," Holmes stated, standing up and facing us, "is the living repository of the Church's ancient history. According to my research, the ability to read the Codex of St. Shenouda flawlessly serves as a secret requirement of the patriarchal initiation. It is taught to the designated successor orally, privately, over many years. It remains unrecorded in any modern grammar book. No impostor, regardless of his brilliance or his hours spent in the libraries of Cairo or Oxford, could possibly replicate the fluid, natural reading of a man who has been steeped in this dead language from his youth as a sacred duty." "A linguistic trap," Halifax whispered. "It is brilliant, Holmes." "We shall see," Holmes replied. "Lord Halifax, I ask that you bring both claimants to my rooms this evening at 8 o'clock. Assure them both that this is the final hurdle to their official recognition. Ensure a heavy police presence inside the house, for whichever man fails this test may react with profound desperation." The atmosphere in our sitting room that evening was thick with tension. The oppressive heat of the day lingered, and the gas lamps cast long, flickering shadows against the walls. Lord Halifax stood nervously by the fireplace. I sat near the window, my hand resting near the heavy walking stick I had procured for the occasion. At exactly 8 o'clock, heavy footsteps sounded upon the stairs. The door opened and the 2 patriarchs were ushered into the room, flanked by 4 plainclothes policemen. Seeing them side by side was a jarring experience. The physical resemblance was indeed uncanny, a testament to the impostor's meticulous preparation. They glared at each other with unvarnished hatred, the air crackling with mutual animosity. "Gentlemen," Holmes said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade, "I thank you for coming. The British government deeply regrets the indignity of this situation. We recognize that one of you is the true spiritual leader of millions, while the other is a fraud of the highest order. Tonight this matter ends." He gestured to the table in the centre of the room, upon which the Codex of St. Shenouda lay illuminated by a single, powerful reading lamp. "Before you lies an ancient text of your faith," Holmes continued. "You both claim to be Amber Macarius. You both claim the esoteric knowledge of the Patriarchate. I ask that each of you in turn approach the table and read aloud the first paragraph of this manuscript, translating it into English." A profound silence descended upon the room. The claimant from the Langham Hotel, the man with the manicured nails and the flawless English, stepped forward first. His face was a mask of supreme confidence. He approached the table, leaning over the fragile papyrus. He stared at the script. For a moment nothing happened. Then a slight furrow appeared upon his brow. He leaned closer, his eyes darting frantically across the ancient ink. The seconds ticked by, agonizingly slow. I watched a single bead of sweat break out upon his temple and roll down his cheek. It is a variation of Sahidic," he stammered, his deep voice losing a fraction of its resonance. "It speaks of the nature of the divine light, the light which illuminates the darkness. No, the darkness which cannot comprehend the light." He was guessing. It was painfully obvious. He was utilizing his vast knowledge of standard Coptic theology to try and deduce the meaning of the cipher, leaving the specific phonetic flow and the natural rhythm of the language entirely out of his grasp. He stumbled over the words, his translation halting and generic. "Thank you," Holmes said abruptly, his voice devoid of emotion. "That will suffice, if you please, sir." He gestured to the second man, the claimant from Kensington, the man with the calloused hands and the weary eyes. The second monk stepped forward. He kept his gaze averted from the other man. He approached the table and cast his eyes upon the manuscript. Instantly, a profound change came over him. The weariness seemed to vanish from his posture. His eyes widened, reflecting deep, reverent awe rather than panic. He reached out a trembling hand, letting his callous fingers hover mere millimeters above the ancient parchment. Then he began to speak. The sounds that emerged from his mouth were alien, guttural, and incredibly complex. Instead of a man reading a dead language, he sounded like a man speaking his native tongue. The words flowed in a rhythmic, chanting cadence, filling our dusty London sitting room with the echo of an ancient Egyptian monastery. He read for nearly a minute, his voice rising and falling with the natural intonation of intimate familiarity. Then he stopped, closed his eyes, and translated into his raspy, accented English. And thus Abba Shenouda spoke to the brothers. "Beware seeking the Lord in the gold of the altar or the fine linen of the vestments, for the moth consumes the linen and the thief steals the gold. Seek him in the silent agony of the desert, where the sun burns away the flesh and leaves only the spirit naked before the eye of heaven. For only when you are nothing can the Almighty become everything." Silence hung in the room, heavy and absolute. The translation was beautiful, precise, and carried the unmistakable ring of spiritual truth. Holmes turned to the first claimant. The man's face was ashen. His supreme confidence had entirely shattered, replaced by a look of sheer, naked terror. "A brilliant performance, Father Youssef," Holmes said softly. "You studied the theology, you mastered the history, you even acquired the perfect ring. You fail to realize that a religion transcends a mere administrative body. It operates as a living memory, and you did not possess the memory." "It's a trick!" the impostor roared. Knowing his scholarly ruse was destroyed, he lunged toward the table, his hands grasping desperately for the ancient papyrus, intent on hurling the condemning evidence into the roaring fireplace. "Watch him, Watson!" Holmes shouted. I sprang from my chair, bringing my walking stick down hard across the impostor's forearm. He shrieked in pain as the policemen threw themselves upon him, wrestling him to the wooden floor before he could lay a single finger on the priceless artifact. The true patriarch, Amba Macarius, did not even flinch at the violence. He stood looking down at the ancient manuscript, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "He was my brightest student," the patriarch whispered, his voice thick with sorrow. "Ambition poisoned his soul long before he tried to poison my body. Thank you, Mr. Holmes. You have saved my church." Later that night, after the impostor had been hauled away to Scotland Yard and Lord Halifax had departed with the true patriarch, profusely expressing the gratitude of the British Empire, Holmes and I sat alone in our rooms. The heat wave had finally broken, and a cool, refreshing rain was lashing against the windows of Baker Street. Holmes sat in his armchair, his violin tucked beneath his chin, playing a slow, mournful melody. "A fascinating case, Watson," he murmured, pausing in his playing. "A study in the limits of intellectual forgery." "You suspected the man at the Langham from the start," I noted, pouring us both a small measure of brandy. "The manicured nails were the first indication. The true confirmation lay in the nature of perfection. The impostor was simply too perfect. His story of the ambush was dramatic. His answers were too immediate, too polished. He was a man acting a role he had rehearsed 1,000 times. The true patriarch was tired, broken by betrayal, and completely unconcerned with presenting a flawless facade. He freely admitted his ring was a fake because he knew his true authority resided entirely independent of gold, resting strictly in his mind and his spirit. And the ancient script? "A calculated risk," Holmes smiled, taking the brandy glass from my hand. "I deduced that an institution as ancient and insular as the Coptic Patriarchate must possess internal safeguards against usurpation, safeguards entirely inaccessible to any apostate or lower-ranking monk. The Codex of St. Shenouda provided the perfect litmus test. The impostor attempted to translate it intellectually. The true patriarch recognized it spiritually." He raised his glass toward the window where the rain was washing the grime from the streets of London. "To the silent agony of the desert, Watson," Holmes said quietly. "May it forever remain a mystery to those who seek exclusively gold and fine linen." With that he tucked his violin back under his chin, and the haunting, beautiful strains of a solitary sonata filled the room, providing a fitting requiem for the strange and perilous case of the two Coptic patriarchs. Thank you for listening. If you'd like to hear more stories, be sure to check out my Patreon. The link is in the description below.